So Rick, thank you ever so much for your time today, and welcome to the Eastlight Academy. My first question is, the Housing Ombudsman is what it sounds like. It's one person, it's you, Rick Blakeway, and yet you have this whole organisation who works for you. So what is the Housing Ombudsman? What do people mean by that phrase?
So we're there as an independent, impartial, free-to-access service to resolve individual disputes. And if you like, we're an alternative to the courts. And so if you make a complaint to your landlord and you're not happy with the outcome, then you can bring it to us and we can investigate it. And one of the things which I just say, which is really important about our work, is that one of the things which we really focus in on is fairness. And we're there as an advocate for fairness, and we think about, the individual circumstances of each case. We do other things as well. So we champion and seek to raise local complaint handling standards, so the way in which landlords themselves handle complaints. And we also promote learning from complaints to see whether lessons can be identified to hopefully prevent complaints occurring in the first place.
So you're kind of like the Supreme Court for residents. Is that a fair thing to say? Like, if you've got a problem with your housing association, whatever it is, repairs, ultimately you're the ultimate arbiter of those situations.
Yeah, the decision that we make is a final decision, and the only way our decision can be made, challenged on an individual case is to seek a judicial review about the process through which we've made our decision. So in that sense, we are a kind of final decision on a case, but we're not sort of sat there kind of reviewing the landlord's process, if you like, or reviewing the final response the landlord gave. What we do is a proper investigation, a thorough investigation, and we can define the complaint as well. This is a really important point. So sometimes we'll say, well, actually looking at this, we're a bit concerned about the landlord's record keeping, or we're a bit concerned about the way it handled the complaint, even though the resident's there saying, look, I've got a repair and I want this repair sorted out. We'll think about the scope of the investigation, we'll define that investigation, and then we'll produce our report and orders. If we uphold either the complaint or elements of the complaint, we'll produce orders to put things right, to put the resident back in the position they would have been if things didn't go wrong.
But you're not the housing regulator, are you? The regulator for social housing is an entirely different body. So could you tell us a bit about the difference between the two? In my notes it says that the housing regulator has consumer regulation powers and you have consumer redress powers. So perhaps you could explain the difference between those two.
Sure, I think there's distinct roles for a regulator, distinct roles for an ombudsman, but it is really complementary. And so I would say that an ombudsman is kind of quite bottom up in the way that it approaches things. It receives individual complaints. It will investigate those complaints. And what we'll seek to do is, from the range of that information, then identify any lessons that can be applied either in the landlord or across the sector. And that's quite a bottom-up approach, if you like. Whereas a regulator, I would describe, is more top-down. They look at the board, they look at governance, they look at the organisation and seek to identify whether there are any failings in that organisation to meet the regulatory standards that are set out. So that kind of top-down and bottom-up approach, I think, is genuinely complementary and gives you as a landlord a kind of 360 view of how your services are working and what your residents are experiencing.
Can you tell us then, are there any trends within your current work? What kind of things is the Housing Ombudsman really keen to see?
So about 40% of the cases that we receive are about repairs, and that's been the case for many years now. But I think it shows you some, often quite profound issues that we're seeing around repairs and whether they're being effectively dealt with. Unpacking that a little bit, areas I think of concern can be things like communication. Sometimes communication with residents just simply isn't as effective as it needs to be, and landlords need to really think about how they can communicate well with residents. Other areas are record keeping. It can sound dry, but an administrative error can lead to profound human consequences. and have profound organisational consequences. But too often in cases we're finding gaps in the information that landlords have, and if landlords can't access that information to support an investigation by us, then how can they possibly use that information to improve their services? And then repairs overall is something that landlords just need to look at. Too many missed appointments, too many ineffective responses, too many things not being put right first time, and that's something which I know many landlords are concerned about. It's reflected in our casework, and it's an area for them to focus on.
And a lot of what you do as well is almost kind of soft power, isn't it? It's not just about making judgments, it's about giving guidance to housing associations, telling them what kind of things they should be doing and can expect.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And we've got, if you like, a range of powers, some which are softer than others, some which are, are really clear and quite directive, I suppose. And I think one of the things which is a really important aspect of our work is kind of openness and transparency. We have gone through, particularly in the last couple of years, a real process of opening up both how we make decisions and then what decisions we are making. And every 2 weeks we publish our casework so people can see the outcomes of our work. And like say things like our complaint handling code are a lot more kind of really clear, saying, look, these are the standards you need to meet if you're going to effectively deal with complaints. And that code, subject to Parliament, should become law as well. That's a really, really important thing. At the other end of the scale, we make recommendations on how landlords can prevent complaints, can learn from complaints, can do things better, because you may not have done something wrong, but you could do something better. So we would say that even where we don't necessarily find fault or failure, there could still be lessons learned. And that is something which we really ask boards to champion, to look at, how can they champion learning from complaints? Because ultimately complaints are, if you like, a mirror to the landlord. They're a reflection of how their services are working, the daily experience of their residents engaging with different parts of the organisation. And that's valuable information, valuable insight. It could tell you as a board member things that you might not discover from other bits of information, from the reports that you get from the executive. So delve into those complaints. Think about what those complaints are telling you, because they're really a good way of finding out what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. What then, from your perspective, from the Ombudsman perspective, what does good look like for housing association boards? What should they be thinking about?
So I think the first thing is kind of getting the culture right. Culture has to be driven by the board, and that kind of leadership and getting the right behaviours are absolutely essential. So we talk about a positive complaint handling culture, and that's been making sure your complaints process is accessible, making sure there's good awareness of it, putting things right if they've gone wrong, being open-minded and demonstrating learning that you've taken where something has gone wrong. And I think those are really important attributes to a positive complaint handling culture, and I think that's first and foremost one of the things which all boards need to consider and get right. I think the second thing, which is I guess really important, is to think about, well, look, how can we use our complaints to really address issues that frequently come up where there could be unfairness. And then I think the third thing is one of the ways in which we make our decisions is not just based on we consider the law, but it's not confined to the law. So we'll think, well, what does good look like? What is best practice? And that's, and was it fair? When we investigate, we think, was it fair? And that's why I say we're not an advocate for the landlord or for the resident, but we are an advocate for fairness. And I think, the social purpose that drives so many people to want to be involved in social housing and drives the sector, I think looking at our work, looking at complaints, is a really effective way of thinking about, do we meet our aspirations? Are our values reflected in the services that we provide?
And so I suppose people will ultimately ask, where does your authority come from, really? It says in my notes here, The Office of the Housing Ombudsman is an executive, non-departmental public body of the UK government, which is sponsored by the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. So what does that mean? How do you relate to MPs? How do you relate to Parliament?
Our scheme is set up through statute, through the 1996 Housing Act, and one of the things which that legislation requires is for my appointment to be made by the Secretary of State, whoever that may be at the that given moment in time, and then I am once that appointment is done, and it's done through a process that involves scrutiny by Parliament as well, I'm accountable to Parliament for and to the Secretary of State for the kind of the budget of our organisation, things like that. But our decisions are independent, and I think that's absolutely critical. We own our decisions, if you like. They are decisions that we make without interference from government, from Parliament, from others. This is our work, our decisions.
Totally non-party political.
Oh, absolutely essential. Absolutely non-partisan, non-political, and the key thing is that our decisions are independent, and that's, I think, partly where they derive their authority. By being able to make an independent decision, both landlords and residents can have confidence that we've looked at it in, as I say, an impartial way and reached our conclusions. And we'll set that out in some detail when we publish our reports, and that will tell you, how we've assessed the case, how we've approached the investigation, and what we've found. And that, I think can be a really valuable thing for people, because otherwise, an alternative might be no redress at all, or seeking the courts process, which is a much, more adversarial process.
Costly as well for people. So
it costs money. It's a very different process. It's an adversarial process. Our process is non-adversarial.
So my final question really is, from your perspective as the Housing Ombudsman, what one piece of advice would you give to residents who are looking to get more involved in their housing association and even potentially being on the board?
Well, I think for a resident, whether they're involved or not, I think one of the first things is to, have trust and confidence in the complaints process. When I started this role, there was, you'd hear things, and if I make a complaint, I'll be seen as a troublemaker, or it might have some sort of implication for me, and that simply isn't the case. And so I'd want residents both to feel confidence in using the complaints process and coming to the Ombudsman if they're not happy with the response that they get from the landlord, but also talking to their neighbours, encouraging their neighbours to engage in that process and use it. And then if you want to be on the board, or that's such a valuable role. And my strong piece of advice is not just to look at the quantitative information that you get, the statistics, the data that you get. Also think about the qualitative information that you have. And whilst getting out and seeing homes is a really important part of the role, and not just the homes that have recently had a liquor complaint, but look at all the homes that landlords are responsible for, but also read our reports, read our decisions, because they are essentially stories. They show the experience that a resident has had over months, sometimes years, and that is really powerful. And I think reading those reports gives you a real sense of actually what is the experience like for residents living, with a tenancy with the landlord. What is their experience? And look at that information, look at those reports, because it shows you something, tells you something that you might not see elsewhere.
Richard Blakeway, Housing Ombudsman, thank you ever so much.
Thanks.